We're telling individuals that it's in our hands to address the climate crisis, and we're not actually addressing the fundamental structures that reproduce climate change and atmospheric concentrations of CO2. People are fed up with business as usual and the solutions coming from the people who created the problem.
Hello and welcome to the COPOut Podcast, an opportunity for apocalyptically optimistic climate conversations. Today is episode 3, and I am privileged and excited to be joined by two amazing scholars who have done applied work to help make the world a better place. So I want to welcome Lauren and Pam to the podcast. And I thought we would just start by having a conversation about maybe if you could each start by introducing yourselves and talking about how you each have used science to inform climate policymaking. You have come at it in different ways and with different connections to different issues and different areas of science. So I just thought it would be great if you could talk briefly about how you came to do the work and your experiences to the degree that you've worked specifically with the climate regime, any experiences you have. Pam, you want to go first?
Yeah, I'm happy to go first. Yeah, so I'm Pam McElwee. I'm professor of human ecology at Rutgers, the public university in New Jersey. And I guess I come at the climate regime from a couple of different angles. So I'm primarily a social scientist, but I do have a PhD in forestry as well. So I kind of cross a little bit the social and natural sciences. And one of the areas of work that I'm really interested in is why, for many years, the climate regime has ignored, well, I shouldn't say ignored, but downplayed biodiversity, not integrated biodiversity and food and land-based issues as much as it has focused on other issues. So I've been interested in that for a while. And I do a lot of work with science policy institutions, so IPCC for climate, and then IPBES. People may not know IPBES stands for the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. It's the biodiversity equivalent of IPCC. So I have been a lead author on reports, and I most recently co-chaired one of the reports for IPBES, which was about the intersections of biodiversity, water, food, health, and climate. And the idea is what does our scientific evidence tell us about why we need to potentially integrate all of these topics? And so I also go to the biodiversity COP sometimes. I did go to the biodiversity intersessional COP this year, but not going to the climate COP. So.
Wow. Well, first of all, I did not know that you pronounce it IPBES. I was actually a lead author on the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment a lifetime ago. Yes. So it's great to see the work continuing to connect the regimes for sure. And these issues that obviously are not in silos because the world is not a silo. Yeah. Lauren, why don't you tell us a little bit about your work and your perspective?
So first of all, I'm reveling in all the unpaid for work that everyone has done for these giant assessments, yes. Uncompensated. So I'm Lauren Gifford. I'm a professor of carbon management, assistant professor of carbon management at Colorado State University. I also run our Soil Carbon Solutions Center, and I'm a fellow with our School of Global Environmental Sustainability. I have been focusing on the COP process and thinking about the COP process for almost about 20 years. I was finishing up a master's degree in 2007, and my then advisor, someone named Michael Dorsey, said to me, there's these things coming on, there's these mechanisms that are coming about called carbon markets, and they actually have really unjust implications, and we need to study what the carbon markets mean, particularly for the people who have contributed least to climate change. So we embedded the study of carbon markets and the COP process under the umbrella of climate justice. And that's sort of at the root of all the work I do. So I wrote a dissertation on REDD and forest carbon offsets. I'm a social scientist. I'm a human environment geographer, a political ecologist. I've been tracking the COP process just largely to see what is the discourse at this multilateral level and how does that trickle down to implications on the ground. So I've written about target setting like 1.5 or 350 parts per million and how those can be tools for policy making, but also obscuring the real work that needs to be done for transformations. I've become a little disillusioned with the COP the last few years. So I'm not there this year, but I do have a close colleague and friend, Emily Height, who's a professor at St. Louis University, and she is a anthropologist, and she is like texting me all day long everything she sees. So if you can have like an on-scene anthropologist, I highly recommend it.
That's amazing. Perhaps she could do some sort of live streaming or something for everybody. So I'm so excited about all the different overlapping ways that this conversation can go. But I think that one thing that also was the reason that we all got connected is I had posted something about how frustrated I was with the climate regime and this process on Blue Sky, asking people about their perspectives on, how effectively the regime is working, especially as the climate crisis is worsening. And I was hoping you could share a little bit about your thoughts, because I know you both have been involved. We had the podcast episode 2, we had everybody reminiscing about the beauty of, COP6 back in 2000. So there may be a kind of moment where you felt like the climate regime could really help with this multilateral effort to address the climate crisis. But I'm curious about kind of how your thoughts about the climate regime and climate policymaking have shifted and where you are now in that. So I guess we'll go back to Pam, but feel free to converse amongst yourselves as well.
Yeah, sure. So my first job out of undergraduate was working in DC for a little known person, Al Gore. So Al Gore went to the 1992 genesis of all of these regimes. Like, he was the person that was negotiating on behalf of the U.S. for all of the Rio conventions. So the climate one, the biodiversity one, and the land degradation convention. And so I didn't go to the meeting, but I was in the sort of background of thinking about, why are we going to do this? Why does the U.S. potentially want to participate? So I feel like I've been there at kind of the genesis and thinking about all of the ways we thought about things in 1992, how novel it was to really tackle this as a global commons problem. I mean, it seems so quaint now, that but we were so optimistic, right? It's like, wow, these are really on the global agenda finally. It's so amazing that we're talking about climate change. I mean, back in 92, that was, still not nearly as common as it is now. And to focus on the idea that we're going to have new regimes on this. I mean, it really was a sort of different time period. And then fast forward to where we are now, we can kind of look back and ask questions about, have we achieved the goals? I mean, I can think of a couple of questions I would ask now. It's like, why do we have 3 different conventions on climate, biodiversity, and land degradation? They're all part of the same problem. And so now these 3 conventions are being told to work more closely together. And it's like, well, 33 years on, maybe we should have started with that as an integrated approach, right? So I think the siloed nature of the way we're approaching these problems has been part of this. And particularly for my area, which is the intersection between climate and biodiversity, everything that Lauren was talking about in terms of carbon markets, huge problem for biodiversity, right? If we just have a focus, particularly on carbon and the ways in which our various land-based ecosystems, or ocean-based ecosystems as well, sequester carbon to the exclusion of thinking about enrichment of biodiversity, enrichment of livelihoods. All of that is hugely problematic. And so, I wish I could go back in time and tell everybody in 1992, no, do it the different way. But, we got what we got. And so we have to kind of deal with it as they are now, I guess. But yeah.
And I think to tag on to some of the stuff that Pam said, which is that the task at hand is much more complicated than it was, 20, 30 years ago, when we're saying, let's put this on the agenda. Now it's highly political. It's on the agenda, but it's highly political and contested and disputed. It's also now we have to figure out how to get there, right? We even know the transformations necessary to get us there, but how do you get there? This roadmap. And that's why we're seeing these debates. I'm just writing down so many acronyms when I'm trying to, it's like Article 6, and Article 6 is supposed to prevent us from double counting carbon, but also to prevent leakage. But then what is the acronym of the UTMs, the unilateral trade restrictive mechanisms, are now preventing development in the least developed countries. So it gets very, very messy very quickly. And I think one of the things that sort of overarches all this is that this discourse is that we are using capital and finance as the primary tool of addressing climate change. And when you create financial-based mechanisms, by and large, they are designed to help investors and banks and the funders, right? So that's part of the problem. It's not getting at who is feeling the impacts of climate change first and most acutely.
So much to unpack here. I mean, I'm going to go backwards.
Sorry to just unroll all this on you, Dana. We're like,
no. It's great. This is good because let's see if I can juggle. But let's go backwards though. So there is this conversation I know about trying to get folks to commit more funding to the least developed nations to help to support developmental assistance and to help with, adaptation, etc. We had a little conversation about this during episode 2, but I want to continue this conversation. Let's start there. Okay. So we have this question about, is more money that gets committed but never actually shows up in people's pockets, is that a valuable thing to waste, carbon on, or waste air on, or waste oxygen on, whatever gas you want to use? And then the other question that I was curious about is, we saw 2 days ago now a coalition of indigenous peoples who basically stormed into the negotiations, and there's some really great videos online. I'm curious about kind of thoughts about that, because I think there's clearly evidence that this system, which is, bloated and overwhelmed with these different pavilions, including my favorite, the OPEC pavilion, right? The idea that there are still folks who are feeling completely left outside, so much so that they're forcing themselves in. So let's start there, and we'll go backwards. There's so much to say. I mean, and while Al's been giving some really spicy talks lately, I don't know if anybody would listen to us young women back in the 1990s, even if we had been brilliant, as I'm sure we all were.
Can I jump in there? Because my entryway to the COP was with the Climate Justice Now Network, which was a network of networks, essentially, of organizations around the world thinking about climate justice. And some of the ways that they talked about it in Copenhagen and in Cancun and even in Paris, people were wearing these buttons that said WTF, where's the finance? Because the finance wasn't committed. Or in Copenhagen, it was committed, but it never materialized. Mm-hmm. So it's where is the finance? Also, at the same time, part of some of the activism that was happening in the COP was organizations yelling that the UN was silencing civil society. So I think what we saw this last week with the indigenous community who busted into the COP, that's part of a long frustration with the COP process, and a really deeply embedded frustration that civil society, indigenous communities, sort of land-based communities all feel disenfranchised from a process that dictates how their land is used and how they exist in the world.
Well, we also saw the Poor People's March, the Landless People's March that was in South Africa. I mean, I have to say that I actually, right after seeing that, I started thinking about how we very well could see COP30 look a lot like COP15, which was the climate negotiations in Copenhagen, where I wrote one of my most cited pieces, which is how the merging of movements left civil society out in the cold, which is all about basically what happened to civil society and why it happened to civil society in Copenhagen. It was really a turning point for access for civil society NGO observers and the ways that they were treated and what they could actually do. I mean, when I was doing my PhD, which was during COP6, we were able to go in with NGO observer badges and actually go into the plenary and observe. You could just sit there all night. I mean, I had friends in graduate school who were writing dissertations who literally just stayed up all night and they did this ethnography of what was happening. You can't even do that anymore. Yeah. So it really has changed, and I think it's really important to note that these problems, maybe they were like hairline fractures that are starting to expand. Maybe they freeze, they expand. I'm not sure if the metaphor is very useful here, but the idea is that I think these cracks are really, the age is showing here. Pam, do you want to add in?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I might backtrack a little bit. I'm assuming most people that are going to listen to this podcast kind of know what the COP is, but to me, it's helpful to tell my students that the COP is kind of multiple things at once. There's the formal negotiations, which are happening, as you say, Dana, mostly behind closed doors. You can still go to some of the negotiations, depending. I mean, there's so many negotiations going on text on different things. There'll be like, a meeting on a particular article of text in one place. There'll be a meeting on something else someplace else. And so there's a ton of stuff kind of overlapping. And so all of that is done by states, right? States who are parties to the actual convention. And so it requires that the delegations from these states and countries often have to have like 30 people to be going to all this stuff. And so it really disadvantages poorer countries, small developing states who might only be able to send 1 or 2 people. And so they just go to the main events and they're missing all these other negotiations because they can't duplicate themselves and send in a million different directions. So the U.S. is not there this year. When the U.S. used to go, we would be one of these large delegations. There would be tons of people from State Department, some of our federal agencies that have expertise in climate, NASA and so forth. They would be spreading out and following all these negotiations. But we're not there this year, and we can talk about why that's probably a good thing. But so there's the formal negotiations, and then there's all the side events, which is like the biggest conference ever that you're going to run into all the people working on climate who are from NGOs or from academia and so forth. And then there's all of this additional panels and discussions and networking and so forth going on around the side events, which are public and which you can, well, I should say there's usually different gradations. There's a sort of super public one where just anybody can wander in. And then there's a slightly more closed off version of side events where you have to have a delegate badge to be in. And so the things that you would get from going to a conference, meeting people and networking with them, that's a big part why people go to the COPs sometimes. They don't really care, or they're not part of the formal negotiations. They don't have any role to play there, but they're doing this like side stuff. And so I think we have to kind of distinguish, like, what's the point of going to COP? Are you doing the side stuff and you're getting stuff out of that? Or are you maybe following the negotiations, you're doing research on the negotiations, or maybe you're part of the delegations that actually are negotiating. And I know there's a lot of researchers who are embedded in some of these delegations. And so they're either in the country, that they're a citizen of that country, or they're helping those delegations, those small delegations that need extra bodies. Some of our academic colleagues are really great about sort of filling in the spaces that are needed. And so there's all these multiple roles going on. And so I just wanted to be clear that, like, just because one space is closed off doesn't mean the other one is closed off, but you have to kind of specify, like, why am I there? What am I supposed to be doing there? What am I getting out of it? And then what am I contributing? And I think the people that just kind of go to have a party is kind of an increasing number of people, and like the less useful bit of COP. Like, there's a lot of other useful things that we could be doing.
Well, I mean, I would just say that, I mean, that was very useful kind of overview for anybody who's listening who is not has not had the experience of COP. I mean, I would just say that, as I've written in many places over many of the last few years, the idea of going to participate in side events with people who are here based in Washington, D.C., whom I could see by taking a metro, is outrageous. And, I've been invited to numerous side events where I can't stomach the idea of flying to the other side of the world for that. I mean, it is like literally a waste of carbon, because there are lots of other opportunities for us to go to conferences to participate. I mean, and we don't have to all agree on that. And I know that some other people feel like it's a really great way to get together with people who they collaborate with from other parts of the world. But it has become this amazingly bloated experience where right now we have the climate, the Secretariat is actually staying on a cruise ship because of housing concerns, housing limitations, and the price for staying in basically what looks like a shared, very, very, very bare bones apartment is so amazing. I mean, it's just that the way that people are having to spend money, but then also the idea that people are wasting money in that way is also outrageous, because it gatekeeps in terms of who gets access in a bunch of other ways as well. I mean, I wrote a paper 20 years ago on disenfranchisement, which was all about the climate regime and how the climate regime actually was empowering and enabling and being much more transparent than other regimes that we were comparing it to. It just doesn't do that anymore. And that really changed. And I think the shifting moment was in Copenhagen, as Lauren mentioned.
And I wanted to tag on to something that Pam said, which is and I don't know if it's still happening anymore because of these increasing restrictions, but there used to be groups like Islands First would connect American law students with these smaller delegations. And my husband grew up in Fiji, and I reached out to the Fijian delegation and all these Fijian politicians right before the Paris meeting, the Paris COP. And I said, oh, I'm going to be there. I'm self-funded or, like university funded. If you need help negotiating the climate finance track, reach out. And I didn't hear anything. And then like week 2, I get an email that was like, come over, meet us in the cafeteria right now. And I went and met these 2 guys. One still works in climate and is incredible. One was just sort of an administrator. They knew my in-laws because there's only 600,000 people in the entire country. One of them had been to their house. So that was really, really fascinating to see what these men were tasked with, which was multiple nuanced texts and that essentially said the same thing. And this was back in like the should versus shall days, right? Where you hold up the entire negotiation because do we say should versus shall, and everything's in brackets, which means like come back to it later. And seeing that level of bureaucracy that goes into it and the unevenness, what Pam was saying with like some countries are very well equipped to cover all of this and some are not, was really, really eye-opening for me. But also I couldn't get into the actual negotiations. We had to meet in the cafeteria. And I like helped them make some suggestions and then they went back in. But it was a really life-changing experience and changed how I look at the COP process.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to just go back to something that Pam had said before, which had to do with thinking about these different tracks that were all born of the UN Conference on Environment and Development that was in 1993, where the climate regime, the biodiversity regime, the desertification regime, et cetera, and so forth, were all born, right? So all of these different regimes were born, and like Pam was describing, we end up seeing these kind of siloed conversations where then there were these interlinkages highlighted. And I know, Pam, you've worked quite a bit on interlinkages between different regimes. But what I wanted to ask about is, so in this moment, we're in 2025 now, is there an easy way to envision a path forward to start to bring together these questions? I mean, we're talking about questions having to do with access, having to do with biodiversity, ecology. There's so many ways that connects directly to climate conversations. So is there an ideal way of thinking about bringing them together? And then is there one that actually seems like pragmatically possible? Yeah. So they're 2 separate parts of the same question, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, people have been talking about bringing them together for ages, like maybe having a joint meeting, right? Why do we have them at different times in different places? Or even just better coordination among the secretariat. So I would say that low-hanging fruit is happening. So just a few months ago, they made their first website together. So like there's a joint Rio conventions website now where it talks about like the things they're going to agree to do together. And so some of it's not surprising around land-based approaches to biodiversity and climate and degradation. But it's pretty low ambition stuff to get them finally talking after 30 plus years. But I will say there is a lot of demand. So I was just at the biodiversity COP only meets every 2 years. It doesn't meet every year, but they do a half-time smaller meeting of their science body. And so I just did that in Panama. And this came up again, as it always does, like how can we have better ties with the UNFCCC? And it occurred to me when I was listening to people, because they've been talking about this for years, some countries don't actually want more integration. They really don't. And even though they recognize these are connected problems, they either don't want integration because they don't want to be asked to do more. They don't want to be more ambitious, particularly around climate. And I won't say what countries those are, but I think we all can imagine. And then other countries don't want to integrate for, I would say, kind of better reasons, all the things Lauren was talking about, which is the climate regime is super heavy on tech and finance. And if those values get transferred to the Biodiversity Convention, which is often much more inclusive of indigenous knowledge and different values for ecosystems, that could be dangerous as well. So it's really interesting to see the folks who don't want more integration, like why they don't want that to happen, right? Because they see dangers in both, kind of for positive and negative reasons.
That's so interesting because they're 2 sides of the same coin, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, Lauren, do you want to add in here?
No, when you asked that question, I got like a PTSD from my comprehensive exams, and I was like, this is an impossible question to answer. So I'm just gonna move on.
Let me add one thing, which is slightly more positive, which is this year was the first year that the Convention on Biological Diversity had a meeting for a new body. So these COPs often have like all the meetings of all the members, but then they have like various bodies under them. The CBD has made a body for Indigenous people. So it's a subsidiary body. It's called 8J. It's like one of these acronym heavy things. It doesn't say Indigenous peoples, but it's a subsidiary body for Indigenous peoples to be part of the negotiations, right? So it is the one subsidiary body that is not run by countries. So if CBD can do it, climate could maybe do it, right? So it might be an opening.
Has CBD been captured by the oil and gas industry in the West?
No.
I would imagine, like, I could imagine if you think about the folks who would be likely to capture the Convention on Biodiversity, I would think maybe
like
Big Pharma.
Big Pharma, yeah.
Big Ag. I've been seeing some stuff from Big Ag and the Big Ag networks at COP right now. If you saw some of those cool things that DSMOG published just like yesterday. But I mean, you do see those? I mean, I've never been to a Convention on Biodiversity meeting, any of their COPs, but do you see those big kind of interests trying to?
They might send like one or two people. It's nowhere near the sort of scale of the fossil fuel lobby that comes to COP. And most of those interests are represented through country delegations, like you can guess, the countries that are sort of big on agribusiness. The United States is not a party to the CBD, I should say that. Like if we were, we would probably be one of those agribusiness countries, but we're just an observer. We never signed it. But some of the other countries that are big on like massive monoculture agriculture are the ones that are kind of slow walking some of the stuff in CBD for sure.
Interesting. So let's talk about Indigenous folks at the climate negotiations. Anybody have insights? I mean, it seems to me that Lauren, given the work that you've done, you may have some thoughts about the demands and what is feasible and what is likely, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of my knowledge is a few years old, and I would sort of defer to Indigenous leaders in that space right now to answer that question. But I think I can speak to sort of the broader justice community, which is that like markets reproduce inequalities. Markets are inherently unjust, and yet we rely on markets as the primary tool for addressing what is essentially a crisis of capitalism. Sorry to get too wonky here, but we all are sort of academics, and who's going to listen to this? I think other academics, right? But if you think about, this crisis of the extraction and combustion of fossil fuels, and we've increased the concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere, and that has led to all of these Earth system changes, many of which have passed tipping points. So I think we've also, as in sort of like world leaders or people in power, have shifted the burden on addressing climate change to those people who have contributed least, right? Don't cut down the forests for small scale agriculture, buy your carbon offsets when you buy clothes from Pact. Things like this, like we're telling individuals that it's in our hands to address the climate crisis, and we're not actually addressing the fundamental structures that reproduce climate change and atmospheric concentrations of CO2. So I think, and that was a bit of a divergence from, what civil society wants, but I think people are fed up with business as usual and the solutions coming from the people who created the problem. And we know grassroots solutions. We know what it takes to create a just transition. And this incredible report that just came out from Action Aid about a week ago, I don't know if you've seen it, it's called Climate Finance for a Just Transition. And they analyzed over 600 investments from the Green Climate Fund, which was designed to address, climate injustice, right, and the climate crisis, and less than 3% of those met what Action Aid deemed just. Giving money to local communities, empowering women,
Can you say that percentage again, please? I didn't see
Less
the
than
report. 3%. 3, not 30.
Yes.
3.
No, 3.
Okay.
And I think one of their numbers is like Jeff Bezos's super yacht costs more than, the amount of green climate funding that has gone to what's deemed a just transition. Teresa Anderson at ActionAid has been doing really great coverage of this on social media. So I really recommend people follow her. But just even the tools that we have created, the Loss and Damage Fund, the Green Climate Fund, they are in the hands of these neoliberal bodies like the World Bank, who are then tasked with distributing them in like a just way. And it's, again, just reproducing these problems.
Yeah, I'd add an additional figure to that. So not just the Green Climate Fund, but all of our climate funds, so adaptation fund, all of the private investments, all of that. If you add that all up together and look at how much of that, we're talking about over $1 trillion per year. How much of that goes to indigenous peoples? Less than 1%. So the people that are on the front lines and who could be part of the solutions are not getting access to that finance. And so it's not surprising that we see people having that frustration. Yeah.
So then the question I have to ask as a follow-up is, within a capitalist system, is there any way you can envision, each of you, addressing, the problems of the climate crisis, and to the degree that they are interlinked with ecological degradation, et cetera, and so forth? Is it possible without shifting the entire system?
Absolutely. We have entrenched our solutions in the continued extraction of oil and gas and just the fundamental existence of that industry. And if we actually pushed back against that, we could see real change. If we invested in the solutions that we know work, renewables, right? Grassroots, community-driven development projects, not top-down development projects. And there's so much, like the Climate and Community Institute and this ActionAid piece, they all say that we know that community-engaged development leads to stronger and longer outcomes. So, we have the blueprint, and we're just going about it wrong.
Yeah, and I would add to all of those, we've talked for years about the need to get rid of public subsidies for fossil fuels and other harmful things, and they go up every year. And so that is just money that is being thrown in a pit that could be used instead for adaptation and locally led adaptation and so forth. So the public subsidies, the public subsidies are bad enough as it is, right? We're talking about, hundreds of billions of dollars. But those public subsidies enable additional private investment because they de-risk continued private investment in fossil fuels, because if you have public money going in, well, it must be a good investment, so I'm going to put private money behind it. So getting rid of those public subsidies would make it less likely that a lot of the private financing of this happens as well. And so why we can't, I know why we don't tackle it, it's because of vested interests, but continuing to bang our heads about this is super frustrating. We know those need to go, and yet they still are in place.
Well, and it contributes to this way that people start to think about these potential stranded assets that are stranded because it was cheap to invest there, even though it was really not cheap and it was just subsidized. Exactly. So, absolutely. Yes. I wanted to talk about. So this is where we're going to have to edit this out for a second.
And I was going to also, Dana, I have something I wanted. It was the first thing I wrote down when you invited me, so we could.
You want? I was going to ask. No, actually, go ahead, because I have all these notes that I'll jump through, but go ahead.
So we all connected because we all said on Blue Sky that, we weren't going to the COP, and we had these very passionate, deeply entrenched reasons why. But I wanted to also share that I feel a lot of ambivalence about the COP process and these big meetings, and that I do actually owe my career to attendance at these COPs. And a lot of the sort of lifelong relationships I made are with climate leaders around the world that I have just seen year after year and been able to collaborate with and learn from. And if I hadn't learned from those folks in these intimate settings, then I would be able to teach what I teach to my students now. And actually, I was with a former negotiator from the Stern era, just last week. And she said, well, there's nothing wrong with a trade. I said, it's a trade show. And she said, there's nothing wrong with a climate trade show. And the more I thought about that, I was like, okay, I mean, I don't know. This is the ambivalence, right? Like, yeah, that climate trade show has actually educated many of us. I've met people that I've gone on to collaborate with an anarchist squat in Warsaw at a climate justice meeting, or in a gymnasium in Cancun at another civil society space around the COP. And I would not have entered these spaces and met these people if it weren't for the COP process. So, I feel really indebted to it. And, maybe that's the benefit of the trade show. But at the same time, flying there and, getting warnings that are saying, don't sell your badge for profit, which is like something that's been happening in the last 2 years, because people are, selling tours essentially for, X amount of dollars. You can get a badge and a tour of the COP. And it's like really disturbing. Like, that's not how we address the climate crisis. But I also feel love for the process.
I agree, but I mean, this goes to one of the questions I was going to ask, if it's okay, Pam.
Yeah.
But it's just, so I agree. I mean, I came up through the COPs as well, early COPs, and I saw the utility of it. In fact, there was a period of time where, finishing up my graduate degree, and I was like, this will be great. I'm going to try to get funding to take students. We'll come here. We'll be part of the process, and the students will help and support these delegations that don't have enough capacity. Or, I mean, there's with the dream, right? But the thing is that in the past few years, those types of, people's fora and other types of civil society and NGO-led events have become extremely limited, or located so far away from the actual negotiations. The question of people flying all the way to the Middle East, for example, so that they can go to this side event that's so far away, really makes very little sense. I mean, and that leads me to one of the questions I was going to ask, because we've talked a bunch about, how to push back against vested interests, but then also how to think about facilitating and supporting a just transition. And most of it starts with talking to and embedding these decisions within communities, be they indigenous communities or frontline communities. And in some ways, I wonder the degree to which the international and the multilateral versus potentially the bilateral or even the local and, subnational are the places where the climate policymaking should really be embedded. And so I wanted to ask you all if you still see that this international decision-making is where it's at, because at least, we went through, I studied the Kyoto Protocol, I studied the Paris Agreement. I don't know what's going to come next, if anything comes next. Certainly the United States is not going to be a party to it at the moment, at least. But so the question is this the time where we say, oh yeah, what we need is another multilateral agreement, or is it really, let's reflect and spend a little time looking inward and empowering more inward? So I just wanted to ask you both that question.
At least for me, I think it can and should be both. I'm like Lauren, that I'm disillusioned with some of the stuff that goes on at COP, but I think it's not a reason to necessarily disengage. So I think I said in my response to you, Dana, on Blue Sky, that basically the real hard work happens between the COPs. And that's where the people who have expertise about some of the negotiations actually do have a chance to provide some inputs. And then they finally, get to texts that are then negotiated at the COP. But there's all of this background. And that detail actually is really important. And I think a lot of that can be informed by what's happening on the ground. So just to give a really tangible example, one of the things they're doing down in Brazil is trying to decide on indicators for the global goal for adaptation. Okay. And so they've been talking about this for a long time. Like, adaptation has gotten the short shrift. It's embedded in Paris, but we always talk about the mitigation goals of staying below 1.5, and we haven't done as much on the adaptation goal. And so now they are at the point where they would like to adopt a set of indicators, maybe around 100 indicators that countries have to report on to see whether we're meeting global goal on adaptation or not. So these can be aggregated. So if they choose the wrong indicators, countries are going to be reporting on stuff that doesn't matter. right? That's not helping locally led adaptation on the ground. So that's a perfect example of, and this has been taking place over the last couple of years. There was an expert group that came up with a bunch of indicators. I think they did a really good job on some. Some are going to be more challenging because we just don't collect that data as it is, and it's going to require some different systems. But if those indicators had gone south and it had been like, not people really engaging in the process who had true locally led, community-based experience on adaptation, it could be a totally different story. And they could be adopting these indicators that were awful. And it could have completely influenced adaptation funding going to the wrong stuff going forward, right? And so all of those decisions that happened over the last couple of years that people really were informed by their community level work, that is going to influence those global level indicators, hopefully in a positive way. And so that's why I think, we shouldn't disengage. We shouldn't just say like, oh, nothing happens there, because stuff does happen there, but it can be informed by what we know works in the communities where things are actually progressing in a much more just manner.
And it gives us a language to have a common conversation.
Sure, but I mean, the question is, do those kinds of conversations require 40-some thousand people?
No.
I mean, and
the answer is no. Or
No,
Dubai,
and actually,
Dubai was 80,000 people. That was the biggest one. I mean, that was crazy.
I think what I heard is that they were expecting 60,000, and it looks like they got less because housing.
50-ish.
Unless you wanted to stay in a tent, Right.
My friend just sent me this event that's happening within the COP, but it's a COP sanctioned side event, A Force for Good, the role of social media content creators in climate communication. And there's like 7 young people who are influencers who are there to talk. And I mean, I know that that's part of the communications discourse now, but it's still a little bit like, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, I think that there's a lot of things that are going on at the COP. I mean, and this goes into what Pam was saying in that really detailed description. There's so much stuff that goes on there. And that was really the thing for me that I find challenging is like, one, if there's not a lot of access, what is the goal? What do you want to get out of it? And two, how many of those things could you do without flying around the world? Right? I mean, it's one thing if you live somewhere in South America, maybe even Central America, but it's another thing. I mean, for me to go down was going to take 18 hours. Yeah. So that, and there are those conversations, but do we need to travel to another country to talk about climate change and talk about how we address climate change or talk about how we try to adapt to our changing climate? We shouldn't have to, but I mean, I realize that that's the way the system has been set up, and maybe there will be a moment for us to think about how we can shift that discourse and that expectation, those assumptions, because I think the time has come, as far as I'm concerned. I want to ask you another question because I know we're going to run out of time really quickly, and in a lot of ways it draws on what we've been talking about. So what I'm curious about is, what do you see as a vision for the future? What do you expect? Or let's see, what do you hope will come out of COP30? And then, not to be the bummer side of it, but what do you expect is really reasonable or rational based on what we know so far about who's in the room and those folks who are trying really hard to drag their feet?
Yeah, I'll say that there was a lot of hope that this COP would be one that really took nature seriously because it's based in the Amazon and it's being hosted by Brazil, and they've really pushed this integrated agenda of trying to think about, where biodiversity intersects with the discussions that are happening. What I think is going to happen is probably not very much integration, and I think a lot of talk, but kind of similar business as usual. Like there's been this new financial fund that Brazil is proposing, this tropical forest fund that they're getting billions of dollars of pledges for. And the idea is that it's going to be more sustainable than the many one-off projects that we've had with RED and other approaches to forests in the past. It's going to be more focused on the global south. It's going to sort of cut out the middleman on some of these monitoring and verification processes. But if you actually open the hood, what it is it's like a financial investment fund that's going to go off and invest in oil and gas exploration, and then the profits that it makes from that, then maybe it'll go to the global south, right? And it's like, that's part of the problem. Like, the whole drivers of forest loss are these things that your trust fund is going to be potentially investing in, right? It's going to be investing in like stock market based publicly traded companies and so forth, which we know are some of the major drivers of forest loss. So it's like, even this thing that is supposed to be presented as like this innovation is not an innovation. It's just kind of this more of the same. And so that's what worries me a little bit, that we're not going to get, it's going to be very incremental, anything that comes out of it. I think the adaptation stuff actually will be more promising than the mitigation stuff, but it's going to be incremental either way.
I think Pam was very eloquent there, so I'll just tag on a little bit, which is that, and part of the momentum that I see in this space in general is a focus on community engaged development, and indigenous knowledge, local knowledge, and the value of that in creating strong climate adaptation measures. And so I hope that focus kind of gains traction, and some of these big investors understand that that's a really valuable space to engage in and to invest in, and to listen to the people who actually are doing the labor of making that change. What I worry that's going to come out of it is much more sort of complex, esoteric financial mechanisms, more of the same, but actually with addendums. And they're going to take an entire contractor scape to parse through and to have each country understand, and each major corporation understand what their responsibility is under these agreements. And that's like creating a whole industry in and of itself, is like making sense of multilateral climate target setting. And I think we'll see more of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in some ways, the complexity and increasing the complexity basically is another layer of limitation to access and transparency, because all of a sudden you need people with more skills, more training, more understanding, more access to, in a lot of cases, these vested interests who tend to have access to power and resources and are controlling it in unfortunate ways. I think it was, I thought I would just ask if either of you have any thoughts there. There was just this announcement about the misinformation efforts to try to do that, which I do recognize is also funded and supported by the same vested interests, that if you track and follow the dark money, that's where it comes from. But I was wondering if either of you have any insights on that, because I think that's a new development that I actually wasn't expecting to see.
Yeah, I think part of it is the really substantial efforts in the last few years from researchers to really track misinformation, like starting with Naomi Oreskes and the Merchants of Doubt book, and then going through the Climate Social Science Network, the CSSN, which is based at Brown, and Timmons Roberts, has really coalesced a whole community around that. And so then it's sort of made its way into countries wanting to track this more carefully. And so the announcement at COP, I think, is really promising. And that's a great example of where you actually can have influence, right? It wasn't the COP itself, but it was all the stuff leading up to it that people were doing, that countries were listening to and being encouraged by. I will say another really important role, particularly for the climate COP, is the very fraught role sometimes of IPCC with the official Framework Convention on Climate Change.
Can you explain that relationship? Because a lot of people don't understand it.
A lot of people don't know that.
I feel like you have a pitch on it.
Yeah, so these conventions are supposed to have science policy bodies that provide the advisory science, that sum it all up, because the countries themselves, they may have their own individual research stations, but they don't have a global perspective, and they're not doing this in the sort of formalized, regular way that science policy bodies can do it. So IPCC advises the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. IPBES, the one that I do a lot of work with, advises the Convention on Biological Diversity. And so oftentimes those conventions will request particular studies. And so the Convention on Biological Diversity actually tells IPBES what to look at. And so they asked for this one that I just did on biodiversity, climate, food, water, and health. The IPCC is a bit more regularized. It has regular assessment cycles, but the outcomes of those assessments are supposed to be taken up. They're supposed to influence the actual decision making that's happening at UNFCCC. It doesn't always happen that way. I will say, as an IPCC author, the chances for influence are in a couple of ways. Like the report itself is supposed to be read by all the parties, and then they bring, whatever they learn from these regular reports into their negotiations. There's also actual meetings with countries in advance of some of the COPs. And so they'll hold what are called structured expert dialogues with countries, and then they can ask questions like, I'm really concerned with how much adaptation financing do we think we should propose? What does the scientific literature tell us? And so those, I think, are actually in some ways more helpful than the broad-based reports sometimes, because countries can actually really dig into them and they can kind of design some policy proposals around them. But then some countries don't love IPCC reports because it kind of helps make the case, a strong case for why we should do things. And so, for example, the UNFCCC usually has a declaration that they welcome these reports. They really appreciate these reports. Well, the 1.5 degrees Celsius report that the IPCC did a few years ago was the only one that wasn't welcomed by the UNFCCC, because some countries don't love to hear that message that they need to do more and they need to do it faster. So it's a really fraught relationship, right? It's like there are some places where it pushes the envelope and some places where countries are like, no, thank you, don't want to hear it, not interested.
I think it's also, as also another IPCC author, I would just say that I think it's also really important to note that the IPCC, actually the government, countries and parties have the ability to oversee and edit the summary for policymakers,
Absolutely.
which I don't believe happens for in the CBD, right? They don't edit.
IPBES has the same process.
Oh,
yeah.
they do. Okay, I didn't realize that, because the
process.
Millennium Ecosystem Assessment did not. But
No.
As a result of that, I can just say that I was both lauded for a sentence that made it into the summary for policymakers for my chapter. I was in working group 3 on mitigation, and yet it was so watered down that it meant nothing whatsoever. And the deal is that whole process means that while the science is, I wouldn't use the word embraced, encouraged, it's not really supported, because we are constantly being edited and blocked in, those of us, I do work around, fossil fuel interests and the roles that they play in, in decision making and in empowering or blocking civil society participation in certain decision-making processes. They don't like that. Yeah. So it gets edited out. And there was a lot of pushback that was just really frustrating. But and the argument was made that if we could get it through, it would make a difference. But instead, I had this ridiculously bland sentence in the summary for policymakers that was just very frustrating, the idea that I even spent time to get it in there. So, I think there are two sides, but I think, it's nice to think that the science is supported, but I think the closer the climate crisis comes and the more certain vested interests feel threatened, the less the science is allowed to actually act as science.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we see that pushback both at the level of the IPCC reports, but then how they're taken up or not taken up by the conference itself. And for sure, like I said, it's fraught, right? On the one hand, there's something optimistic about this idea of co-production between scientists and governments, right? That they're buying into the science as a process of this negotiation. But as you say, Dana, it's also a process of watering down. It's like the least common denominator. And so, yeah, as I said, it's super fraught, right? You can look for optimistic things, you can see pessimistic things, and it's not black and white.
And I would just say to the point on climate obstruction, not surprised to see it at the COP, but I'm also part of that climate social science network. But also we're just in the US, we're experiencing it everywhere, in our state and local governments, in our NGOs and our universities.
In our funding.
So in our funding. Yeah, exactly. What funding, right? So I think this is something that it's like, don't say climate, and while half my town burned 4 years ago, we lost 1,000 homes and businesses in an urban wildfire, literally driven by climate change. So I think, I just think it's everywhere. Climate obstruction is actually now pervasive across scales and spaces and places, and we need to do what we can to combat it. But it's hard, and I empathize with people who. I keep thinking, like, one of the reasons I didn't want to go to the COP this year is because we need to read the room, and there's so many people that I work closely with who are out of jobs, out of funding. And I don't want to be like, and I'm in Brazil, so I think it's a really tough time for people doing the work to address climate change. And I just want to acknowledge, like, anyone doing that in this space right now, we need to, like, provide solidarity because it's an uphill battle, and it's really, really a hard time.
Right. And just to say that, absolutely well said, Lauren. And also just to highlight that while we are all scientists who work with universities, the challenges are even worse the challenges are even more significant for people working in the civil society sphere, working in frontline communities and in communities of color right now, because not only are we no longer allowed to work around or focus on climate, there's also the Justice 40 initiative that has been killed, and all of these ways that thinking about justice and just transitions have been really, cut off at the knees. So much more work to be done. Thank you so much for coming in to help think about the ways that we're going to get to the other side of the climate crisis, and how and why and what we can consider the best avenues forward. So Pam and Lauren, I really appreciate your joining today. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Dana. Thanks,
Thank
Pam.
you.